Well, David Cameron and Barack Obama may be on the same page when it comes to an Afghanistan exit strategy, but according to our next guest, the conduct of the war has ramifications which will continue long past the 2014 date set for Afghans to take over their own security. Anthony Cordesman is the co-director of the Middle East program at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, and his latest assessment on the war in Afghanistan is a scathing indictment of US policy. He joins us now in our Washington studio. Thanks for being there.
Thank you.
As strategists argue over whether the war in Afghanistan is winnable, you've described the conduct of it as one of the worst examples of wartime leadership in American history. Tell us why.
Well, first, let me be very careful. What I described was what happened between 2001 and 2009. The fact is that the United States did not have a strategy. It did not resource the war. It did not provide the troops it needed. It didn't put the proper pressure on Afghanistan. It did not manage the aid effort. It basically flooded money into the country in ways which were a primary source of corruption. It never provided the resources or the trainers to create effective Afghan forces. Now, beginning in the middle of 2009, a lot of that changed. And part of the problem we face is those changes take time. You can't waste 8 years in a war and suddenly turn things around overnight. So we're getting all kinds of deadlines that aren't really deadlines. We're really creating an experiment in civil-military operations now, for which in many cases we have no clear precedents. So I think we need to make a very careful distinction. We made very serious mistakes in the past. We've made a new beginning. That beginning will take more time than many politicians like, and we really don't know the outcome yet.
Do you blame, obviously the majority of that 8 years was under George W. Bush, but do you blame both presidents for mismanagement?
I think it's difficult to blame presidents. A lot of these problems occurred because of weaknesses within the Department of Defense. There was a failure, almost complete failure of leadership within the State Department to even engage in the war in realistic terms at the top, not in the field. And there were very serious weaknesses in the National Security Council, which focused on Iraq. You can't personalize this. It was a broad failure in the United States national security structure. But it is a failure which in many ways has been corrected. And you now have a level of leadership, particularly in the country team in Afghanistan, which offers significant hope that you can turn this war around.
Do you regard President Obama's chief sin, if he has one, in the conduct of the war as his setting of this arbitrary deadline for withdrawal of American troops beginning from July next year?
I think we need to be very, very careful. The president had a speech written which put that deadline in largely for domestic political purposes, to deal with his own party. From the start, that deadline said it was conditions-based, that there might be almost no meaningful reductions in 2011, but it has been misinterpreted virtually all over the world as some kind of deadline for significant U.S. withdrawals. And it's been misinterpreted in spite of the fact the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, all clarified it within 48 hours of the speech. Sometimes, no matter how careful you are, you send the wrong signals, and the President did that. But he also has made repeated efforts to correct it. And when President Karzai came to Washington, he referred again and again to an enduring strategic partnership. He made it clear this was not a deadline in any rigid sense. The problem we have here is there is a large-scale desire on the part of many countries to leave as soon as possible. And many see the American signal as what they would like to have happen and not what the president said.
We've just seen Afghanistan's first major international conference, President Karzai, who's been backed largely, even though he's a beleaguered president, says his own deadline for Afghan security forces to take over is now 2014. Is that a realistic deadline?
There's no real way to know at this point. One thing we have to understand is at the start of this year, having set all of these goals to expand Afghan forces, we had exactly 23% of the trainers and partners needed to train that force. Now, the number has sharply risen, largely as a result of U.S. deployments, but we're still chronically short, not only of trainers, but of the resources and facilities. A lot of those won't be fully operational till this fall. Can we meet the goal? First, it's not a real goal in any sense. You're talking about a formal transfer of responsibility in which there will still have to be very significant U.S. and allied forces, and where virtually all of the money to pay for Afghan forces will still have to come from the outside. It's like the other goal, the idea that somehow 50% of the aid goes through the central government. It's a nice goal, but the fact is that depends on an anti-corruption drive that hasn't begun. And in the real world, what's actually happening is you're putting significantly more aid money into honest Afghans at the provincial, district, and local level and bypassing the central government. So this was a nice exercise in political symbolism. But to make it real is going to be something at best that's going to take several years.
Here's another recent quote, a quote from your latest assessment. It's time to stop demonizing bin Laden and al-Qaeda and focus on the broader threat. What are you getting at?
I think part of our problem is we keep looking at al-Qaeda, but everyone knows that given the demographics, the poverty, the lack of effective secular government, in much of the Islamic world, Central Asia, the Gulf, North Africa, there are going to be continuing Islamist extremist movements which will have a violent terrorist character. And those are not going to disappear when you get rid of bin Laden or al-Qaeda. You have to look at what is a mix of different movements, some of which are affiliated with al-Qaeda and some of which are not. You have to look at the causes behind this extremism and terrorism. If this turns into a hunt for bin Laden, and to some extent it has, it's a little like the hunt for Aidid in Somalia. You miss the point. Even if you win, you haven't done enough with the broader threat to really contain or limit it.
It's interesting to hear the language, though. It's time to stop demonizing bin Laden and al-Qaeda. Could you imagine have even gotten away with saying that in the years straight after September 11? Have things now changed enough that you can reconsider policy to that degree?
I think that many counterterrorism experts made it very clear from the start that the political tendency to focus only on bin Laden and al-Qaeda missed what the real threat, the real set of forces affecting this part of the world really were. And if you go back and look, you'd find, for example, that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, in describing what he called the long war, and this was back in 2001, warned that these threats would be enduring, that they weren't tied to bin Laden, that they weren't tied to al-Qaeda. If you look at virtually any report on terrorism or counterterrorism, you see that this talks about a host of movements scattered throughout the world, and not simply al-Qaeda and bin Laden. I think the problem has been political. It's far easier to communicate in terms of one name and in terms of media, where you take a complex story and you pin it down to one set of names rather than covering what's really happening.
The Taliban are also a complex story. Is it time for the United States to stop simplifying that issue and to allow serious negotiations with elements of the Taliban?
I think we need to be very careful. The United States has never opposed negotiations